In July 1881, 25 men sailed toward the top of the world with enough supplies to last 3 years, orders they believed were clear, and absolutely no idea that their government would forget them. They were dropped on Ellesmere Island, 500 miles from the North Pole, and left there, not for weeks, not for months, for 3 years. The relief ships never came. One was turned back by ice, the other was crushed and swallowed by the sea. And so 25 men, soldiers, scientists, strangers, sat in total Arctic darkness. By the time rescue finally arrived, only 6 were still breathing. What happened inside that tent at Cape Sabine, the starvation, the execution, the unspeakable things men did simply to survive one more hour, was a truth so disturbing that the United States government tried to bury it. On the morning of July 7, 1881, a small steamship named the Proteus pushed away from the docks of St. John's, Newfoundland, carrying 25 men toward a place most human beings had never seen and would never survive. The crowd on the waterfront was modest. There were no grand speeches, no brass bands, no waving flags. The Lady Franklin Bay expedition departed almost quietly, as though the world had not yet decided whether to take it seriously. It would learn soon enough. The men aboard the Proteus were soldiers, scientists, and one photographer, drawn together by a combination of ambition, patriotism, and the particular kind of courage that does not yet know what it is agreeing to. Their commanding officer was First Lieutenant Adolphus Washington Greely, 37 years old, a tall man with a serious face and a Civil War wound still embedded somewhere in his body, like an argument he had never finished. He was not an Arctic explorer. He had never stood on polar ice, never hunted seal from a frozen shore, never watched the sun disappear for 4 months at a time. Neither had any of his men. But Greely believed in discipline, in duty, and in the power of preparation. He had spent months organizing this expedition with the careful intensity of a man who could not afford to fail. The mission was, on its surface, a scientific one. The United States Congress had agreed to participate in the first International Polar Year, a coordinated multinational effort to ring the Arctic with weather stations and collect data that scientists hoped would unlock the mysteries of global climate. 14 stations would be established across the circumpolar north, gathering meteorological, tidal, magnetic, and astronomical data simultaneously. The United States was responsible for 2 of them, one in Alaska and one on the northeast shore of Ellesmere Island, deep in the Canadian Arctic, at a place called Lady Franklin Bay, approximately 500 miles from the North Pole. Greely's job was to build that station, maintain it for 2 years, record everything, and come home. A resupply ship would arrive in the summer of 1882 to bring fresh provisions. Another would arrive in 1883. By the fall of that year, Greely and his men would board a vessel back to civilization and return as heroes of science. It was a clear plan. It was a reasonable plan. It was a plan that began to fall apart almost immediately. Among the 25 men, a handful of characters would define everything that followed. Sergeant David Brainerd was 24 years old, compact and methodical, with a soldier's instinct for logistics and a quiet moral authority that would prove more valuable than anyone could have predicted. Sergeant George Rice was the expedition's photographer, a man of explosive energy and bottomless generosity, described by nearly everyone who knew him as inexhaustible, the kind of person who volunteers for the hardest tasks simply because someone has to. Lieutenant James Lockwood was Greely's second in effective command, cheerful and eager, determined to distinguish himself in the Arctic the same way other men distinguished themselves in battle. Then there was Dr. Octave Pavey, the expedition surgeon. Pavey was the only man among them who had actually been to the Arctic before, which should have made him indispensable. Instead, his relationship with Greely was strained from the first week and would deteriorate into something close to open hostility by the end. And there was Private Charles B. Henry, the heaviest man in the party at 203 pounds, who had volunteered with great enthusiasm and carried secrets that no one on board the Proteus knew yet. The ship reached the coast of Ellesmere Island on August 11, 1881. The weather was clear, the ice unusually thin, the passage almost easy. The men unloaded 350 tons of supplies, food, fuel, scientific equipment, lumber, and began constructing their base, which they named Fort Conger, after a U.S. senator who had supported the expedition. By August 26th, the Proteus had departed. The men watched her disappear over the horizon. They had supplies for 3 years. They had orders to stay for 2. They had no way to communicate with the outside world, and they did not yet know that the easy passage through the ice that had brought them here so comfortably was in fact the worst thing that could have happened to them. Because when their resupply ships tried to find that same path the following summer, the ice would not cooperate again. The trap had not yet closed, but it had already been set. Fort Conger was, by any standard of comfort, a dismal place. The main structure was a prefabricated wooden hut, 3 small rooms, walls as thin as the budget that built them, arranged to house 25 men through an Arctic winter that would reduce temperatures to -40 degrees and below. It sat on a narrow coastal plain between the frozen sea and a ridge of bare rock, exposed to winds that came off the polar ice cap with nothing in their way for hundreds of miles. The surrounding landscape was a study in monochrome: gray rock, white snow, black water, gray sky, broken only in the brief summer months by patches of Arctic scrub that clung to the earth as though they too were soldiers trying to hold a position that reason suggested abandoning. And yet the men made it home, or tried to. They organized themselves with military precision because most of them were military men, and it was all they knew. Scientific observations were taken at fixed hours regardless of weather. Temperature readings, wind measurements, tidal data, magnetic surveys. The work continued through blizzards, through darkness, through the slow psychological erosion that comes from being confined with the same 24 other people in a space smaller than a modest family home. Greely ran the station the way he had run everything in his career, by the book, with high standards and very little patience for deviation. This created friction almost immediately. Lieutenant Kisslingbury, Greely's nominal second-in-command, found himself at odds with Greely within weeks of arrival. The disagreements were, on the surface, about small things, matters of authority, of protocol, of how much latitude officers should have in making independent decisions. But beneath those surface disputes lay a deeper incompatibility of temperament. Greely was rigid where Kisslingbury wanted flexibility. Greely was formal where Kisslingbury was social. The tension between them became, in the cramped quarters of Fort Conger, a constant low-grade irritant that affected the atmosphere of the entire station. Kisslingbury eventually tendered his resignation. He gathered his belongings and walked to the shore to board the Proteus, the ship that would take him home, only to discover that the ship had already departed. The ice had shifted, the captain had seized his window, and the ship was gone. Kisslingbury stood on the shore, staring at the empty water, his resignation in his pocket, and no way to deliver it. He returned to Fort Conger, stripped of his official role, with no duties assigned, living among men he had just tried to leave, under the command of a man he had just tried to resign from. He would spend the next 3 years there. He would not survive. The first winter arrived in October, when the sun set below the horizon and did not rise again for 137 days. This is a fact that people in temperate climates can acknowledge intellectually, but cannot truly understand without experiencing it. Total darkness is not merely the absence of light, it is the absence of reference. The day has no beginning and no end. Time becomes something that is imposed rather than felt, marked by schedules and meals and the readings on instruments rather than by the natural rhythms of light and dark that human biology has calibrated itself against for 100,000 years. Men who had never understood what light meant to them began to understand it now. They adapted, as people do. They organized games and competitions. A Thanksgiving Day race in November that Private William Ellis won easily, earning preserved peaches and tobacco as his prize, racing across the frozen shore with a speed and ease that would seem impossibly distant in 3 years' time. They gave lectures to one another. Young Sergeant Edward Israel, only 21 years old and the expedition's astronomer, described the planets and stars with such vividness that men who had never thought much about the night sky found themselves genuinely transported. They celebrated Christmas with remarkable abundance, a menu that included mock turtle soup, salmon, roast beef, plum pudding, and wine. A feast so incongruous with their surroundings that it read almost as a defiant joke told at the expense of the Arctic itself. But underneath the discipline and the distractions, the isolation was already doing its work. Men who seemed perfectly compatible began to grate against each other. Private arguments became chronic grievances. Dr. Pavey, whose expertise should have been a stabilizing figure, instead was a destabilizing one, scheming, plotting, nursing private ambitions that had no legitimate outlet in the frozen confines of Fort Conger. By the end of the first winter, the social ecosystem of the station had already fractured into factions, loyalties, and animosities that would become life and death matters before the story was over. Spring came, the sun returned, and with it came the question that every man in Fort Conger had been asking in the darkness: where was the resupply ship? In the spring of 1882, with the sun returning and spirits lifting, Greely organized an expedition northward along the Greenland post. The goal was bold: beat the existing record for farthest north ever reached by human beings. That record belonged to the British Arctic expedition, which had reached 83 degrees and 20 minutes north latitude in 1876, a mark considered by many to be close to the absolute limit of what men and sleds could achieve. Lieutenant James Lockwood and Sergeant David Brainerd led the primary team, guided by the Inuit driver Thorlip Christensen. They traveled by dog sled and on foot across sea ice that had no human paths, no landmarks, no mercy. Temperature regularly dropped below -30. Wind scoured the ice into ridges that had to be crossed one by one, each a small battle of its own. On May 13, 1882, Lockwood and Brainerd reached 83 degrees and 24 minutes north, 4 miles beyond the British record. They planted the American flag on a coastline no human had ever touched. They named it Lockwood Island. Then, exhausted and half frozen, they turned south. The record would stand for over 2 decades. In the whole of human history, no people had ever stood further north. Greely recorded it in his journal with characteristic understatement, moving quickly to the next set of observations that needed to be made. What he could not know was that the achievement would be almost entirely buried by what came after. The resupply ship was due in the summer of 1882. The men watched the horizon as the season advanced, rationing their expectations as carefully as they would later ration their food. The Neptune had departed from St. John's in early July, loaded with 8 tons of provisions. But the summer of 1882 was not like 1881. The ice was heavier, the channels tighter. The Neptune's captain pressed north, was turned back, pressed north again, and was repulsed again. Rather than risk his ship, he deposited what supplies he could at Cape Sabine, over 100 miles south of Fort Conger, and turned for home, leaving a note in a cairn the men at Fort Conger had no way of reading. By August, the men accepted the obvious. The ship was not coming. Another winter in the Arctic. No new provisions, no news from home, no way to send word to anyone who might help. The second winter settled in, and with it something harder to name than cold, a compound of resignation and the particular psychological weight of knowing that people at home had failed them, not through malice, but through the ordinary combination of incompetence and bad luck that is, in some ways, harder to forgive than malice, because you cannot even direct your anger at it properly. Greely wrote in his journal. He maintained discipline. He kept them busy. But he wondered in private whether the second ship would come. If the first winter at Fort Conger had been an adventure, the second was an endurance test. The novelty had gone. Excitement had given way to the grinding monotony of being somewhere inescapable. The same walls, the same faces, the same arguments rehearsed with diminishing patience, the same darkness arriving in October and refusing to leave until February. Sergeant Gardner's personal journal recorded what the darkness did to people. He wrote about the aurora borealis displays in November, magnetic storms so intense the men instinctively raised their hands as though they could touch the colored fire, so brilliant they turned midnight into a kind of impossible day. Then the silence that followed, the world settling back into blackness and cold, the contrast making the ordinary darkness seem even darker by comparison. Dr. Pavy's relationship with Greely deteriorated into something beyond professional tension. Pavy chafed at authority under any circumstances, and Greely's brand, rigid, formal, unrelenting, was precisely the kind most likely to provoke him. Pavy began openly questioning Greely's decisions, not always without reason, but always in ways that undermined command rather than supported it. The friction was no longer a personality clash. It was a structural fault running through the center of the expedition. And yet, the scientific work continued. Even as social bonds frayed and psychological pressure mounted, the men kept taking their observations, maintaining their instruments, producing data that would contribute to human understanding of the Arctic in ways still being measured today. The weather data from Fort Conger became essential reference material for climate scientists a century later. The men falling apart inside a frozen hut were simultaneously doing work that mattered. But spring of 1883 brought the question that had stalked them through every dark month. Would the third summer bring the ship? Greely's orders were clear. If 2 consecutive relief expeditions failed to reach Fort Conger, he was to abandon the station and retreat south to Cape Sabine, where supply caches were supposed to have been left by the relief ships. The phrase, "supposed to have been left," would prove to be the most important words in the entire story. As summer 1883 opened, 25 men waited again for a ship that should have been on its way. And in Washington, the people responsible for sending it were engaged in a different kind of catastrophe altogether. While Greely's men endured their second winter, the United States Army Signal Corps was in a state of institutional chaos. The Signal Corps' chief disbursements officer had been arrested for embezzlement, consuming enormous administrative attention at precisely the moment the expedition needed focused management. The Secretary of War was engaged in bureaucratic disputes with the Navy over who bore responsibility for the relief effort. The answer was the Army. The Army was not ready. The 1883 relief expedition was handed to Lieutenant Ernest Garlington, a cavalry officer with 7 years of service and precisely 0 experience in Arctic navigation. He was given command of the Proteus and ordered to reach Fort Conger at all costs. His orders contained a critical provision. Before attempting to push north into Smith Sound, deposit the stores at Littleton Island first. If the ship was lost, at least the food would be safe. Garlington ignored it. On July 22, 1883, the Proteus entered Smith Sound without depositing its stores. The ice closed around her. She was caught, compressed, and crushed. The Proteus sank to the bottom of Smith Sound, taking with her the bulk of the provisions intended for 25 men waiting 500 miles to the north. Garlington and his crew escaped in small boats and returned to the United States. His report to Washington read, "It is my painful duty to report total failure." The Yantic, waiting further south, turned home with Garlington's survivors. Neither ship made any effort to locate Greely. No note was left at Littleton Island. No backup caches were established. Nothing. At Fort Conger, Greely knew only that the second relief ship had not arrived, which meant, according to his orders, he had to leave. The decision was an impossible one. Fort Conger was secure, with shelter and enough food remaining for another winter. If he stayed, he defied orders, and any rescue expedition would look for him at Cape Sabine, not here. If he went to Cape Sabine, he was betting 25 lives on supply caches that may or may not exist. He followed his orders. He told his men to pack. Somewhere beneath the ice of Smith Sound, the Proteus sat in the darkness, full of food that 25 men desperately needed, rusting into the cold forever. On August 9, 1883, Greely gave the order, "Abandon Fort Conger." The men loaded scientific records, essential equipment, and food into small boats, pushed off from Lady Franklin Bay, and turned south into the ice-choked Nares Strait. What followed was 51 days that would have destroyed men with less determination. The boats were small, and the ice was enormous. They rowed when they could, pushed and hauled when the ice closed in, and when it became too dense even for that, they pulled their boats onto a floe and rowed it wherever the Arctic chose to take them. Not always south. The floe turned, the wind reversed, and days passed in which they moved backwards, watching Cape Sabine recede rather than approach. Men who had maintained composure through 2 Arctic winters began, in the helplessness of this open water drift, to show the first signs of genuine fracture. At one point, Dr. Pavey and several influential men, including the respected George Rice, seriously discussed declaring Greely mentally unfit and returning to Fort Conger. The plan required Sergeant Brainerd's agreement, whose moral authority was such that without him the mutiny could not succeed. Brainerd refused. The plan dissolved. Supplies dropped during crossings vanished into the freezing water. Each lost package was a subtraction from an already shrinking margin. Greely recorded every loss with the controlled precision of a man who knew that losing control of his prose would mean losing control of everything else. On October 2, 1883, after 51 days afloat, they came ashore at Eskimo Point, near Cape Sabine. Exhausted and frostbitten, but alive. Sergeant Rice was among the first sent ashore to locate the supply caches. Quick, dependable, thorough. He searched carefully, checking every cairn, every likely hiding place. What he found made his heart stop. There was food, but not nearly enough. The Neptune had deposited a small cache at Cape Sabine, enough for perhaps 40 days if rationed carefully. The Proteus had sunk with the rest. Garlington's note found in a cairn explained what had happened with the detached clarity of a man who would never have to live with the consequences. 25 men, 40 days of supplies, winter closing in behind them like a door. Greely wrote in his journal, "We have been lured here to our destruction." They had not yet begun to die, but they were going to. They called it Camp Clay, clay being both the earth from which things are built and the substance to which flesh eventually returns. The camp sat on Pym Island at Cape Sabine, a bleak and exposed point that offered almost nothing in the way of shelter, hunting, or hope. They laid stone walls in a rough quadrangle, used their largest boat as a roof frame, draped canvas over it, and packed snow against the outside for insulation. The resulting structure was perhaps the length of a large living room, a single low space in which 25 men would eat, sleep, argue, dream, and die through the winter already arriving around them. Inside, Sergeant Brainerd became the man standing between the living and the dead. His role was to control all food at every meal. Private Bender built him a scale precise enough to measure to 1/100th of an ounce. Brainerd calculated rations for 25 men, then 24, then 23, adjusting the arithmetic of survival downward with every death, stretching what remained like a man trying to cover a large bed with a small blanket. What they had to eat was, by any normal standard, nothing. Thin soup from dried meat boiled in water, supplemented by tiny shrimp netted from the Arctic waters, 5 to 10 millimeters long, 1/3 digestible material. Men spent hours in the freezing cold, pulling in thousands of the creatures for a few spoonfuls of nutrition. As winter deepened, they added candle wax, boiled boot leather, bird droppings, seaweed, and reboiled animal bones. The body does not care about dignity. Men lay in their sleeping bags for most of the day to conserve energy. Moving burned calories they could not afford. But lying still meant the mind had nothing to occupy it except hunger, and hunger occupied it completely. Greeley maintained military routine as long as he could. Observations taken, records kept, men expected to behave as soldiers. This discipline was not cruelty. It was the one thing that had kept them alive, and Greeley knew the mind collapses before the body, always. But the mind was already beginning. Sergeant Cross died on January 18th, the 1st. Sergeant Lynn, who quoted, "United we stand, divided we fall," every single day, died on April 6th. And somewhere in the camp, Private Charles Henry Beals was watching everything: the food, the portions, the movements of men too weak to watch him back. Private Charles B. Henry had arrived on the expedition under a name that was not his own. Before joining the 5th Cavalry, he had been released from prison. He had then killed a man, a Chinese laborer, in a barroom altercation, and reinvented himself by reversing his middle and last names. He volunteered with great enthusiasm, carried a strong recommendation from a well-connected officer, and made the cut. Nobody knew his history. Nobody suspected what he was. At 203 pounds, he was the heaviest man in the expedition, charming, capable, and genuinely useful through the years at Fort Conger. At Cape Sabine, when the food ran out, Charles Henry began to steal. It started subtly, a portion slightly smaller than it should have been, a container not quite as full as expected. Brainerd's records caught the discrepancies. Henry denied, then waited, and stole again. He was caught a second time, a third. Each time Greeley confronted him. Each time Henry acknowledged the theft with no apparent remorse, a conscience subordinated so completely to self-survival that it functioned more like an inconvenience than a moral guide. On March 24th, during the chaos of a tent evacuation caused by lamp fumes, men stumbling into -25-degree air, half blind and frostbitten, Henry stole a piece of bacon. He was discovered only when he could not help himself, vomiting up undigested bacon in a camp where no one else had bacon to digest. Greeley warned him in explicit terms. The theft of food from dying men was a crime the expedition could not survive, and that Henry himself might not. Henry stole again. In April, he drank the alcohol reserved for cooking fuel, found drunk in a camp where men were dying of starvation. So brazen it bordered on performance, as though his physical strength, still greater than any two other men even in his diminished state, made him untouchable. He was wrong, but the consequences were not yet ready to arrive. By April, 6 men had already died. The deaths were slow and quiet and terrible, the body consuming itself systematically, muscles first, then fat reserves, then organs, the mind clouding and clearing unpredictably, the eyes becoming enormous in faces that were no longer faces, but the map of bones beneath them. Sergeant Edward Israel, 21 years old, who had given those magnificent lectures about the stars, could no longer sit up by late May. Greeley fed him personally, spooning thin soup into a mouth too weak to manage on its own. Israel died on May 27th, the youngest man in the expedition, and Private Charles Henry stole his shrimp ration on the same day the young astronomer was being spoon-fed by his commander. Before the execution, before the deepest darkness of Cape Sabine, we have to stop and look clearly at Sergeant George Rice. What he did in the final weeks of his life is one of the most purely heroic acts in the history of Arctic exploration. And the fact that history has largely forgotten it in favor of more sensational elements is a small injustice that deserves correcting here. Rice was the expedition's photographer, a Nova Scotian of explosive energy and bottomless generosity, described by everyone who knew him as inexhaustible. In the worst months at Cape Sabine, when other men conserved every calorie in their sleeping bags, Rice was outside netting shrimp, searching rocks for anything edible, refusing to be still. In November 1883, Rice had located a cache of approximately 144 pounds of tinned beef left years earlier by the British Arctic expedition at Ross Bay, 40 miles down the coast. Too late in the season to retrieve then, the decision was made to go back in spring. 144 pounds of meat. For 25 starving men, this was the difference between survival and its opposite. In early April 1884, Rice and Private Julius Shorty Frederick, barely 5 feet 2, were sent to recover it. 40 miles each way in Arctic spring conditions, minus 22 degrees, wind driving cold through every layer of clothing. On one particular day, Rice and Frederick labored for 19 continuous hours in those conditions for the welfare of their comrades. 19 hours on near-starvation rations for men they might never see alive again. When they found the cache, it was gone. The ice had shifted. The location was underwater or buried or simply unreachable. The expedition's best remaining hope had vanished. They turned back toward Cape Sabine, empty-handed. Rice collapsed on the return journey, too weakened by effort, too depleted by cold and devastating disappointment. He lay down in the snow. Frederick, who could barely carry himself, stayed with him, sheltered him as best he could, kept him alive through one more night. Rice died on April 9, 1884, in Frederick's arms. He was 28 years old. Frederick buried Rice in the ice with whatever dignity the environment allowed, then walked back to Camp Clay alone to tell the others. When Frederick arrived empty-handed, without Rice, the men still alive understood immediately. The loss was not just a friend. It was the loss of the expedition's most irreplaceable presence, the person who had always found a way to try. After Rice died, the camp lost something it could not recover. Lieutenant Lockwood fell unconscious that same day and died 12 hours later, still in the tent. The remaining men were measured in days now, not weeks, and Charles Henry was still stealing from them. The order was written in Greely's own hand, addressed to Sergeants Brainerd, Long, and Frederick. Quote, "Private Henry, having been repeatedly guilty of stealing the provisions of this party, which is now perishing slowly by starvation, has so far been condoned and pardoned. It is, however, imperatively ordered that if this man be detected either eating food of any kind not issued him regularly, or making caches, or appropriating any article of provisions, you will at once shoot him." Unquote. This was the order of June 5, 1884. The following day, Henry was caught stealing shrimp from the mess pot. Warned in the most explicit terms possible, he had done it again. Greeley wrote a second order. Quote, "Notwithstanding promises given by Private C.B. Henry yesterday, he has since acknowledged to me having tampered with seal thongs, if not other food. This pertinacity and audacity is the destruction of this party, if not at once ended. Private Henry will be shot today, all care being taken to prevent his injuring anyone, as his physical strength is greater than that of any two men. Decide the manner of death by 2 ball and 1 blank cartridge. This order is imperative and absolutely necessary for any chance of life." Unquote. One serviceable rifle remained in camp, the .45-70 caliber Remington that Private Long used for hunting. The 3 men designated to carry out the execution drew lots to determine who would fire the fatal shot. They took an oath, all 3, never to reveal which one had done it. They kept that oath until they died. Private Charles B. Henry was taken outside the tent on June 6, 1884, and shot. 2 balls struck him. Death was immediate. The reaction among the surviving men was grim acceptance, not shock. No argument about the necessity, not from anyone who was there. In a camp where men were dying weekly, where rations were measured in hundreds of an ounce, where a handful of stolen shrimp could be the difference between life and death, Henry's thefts were not petty crimes. They were direct contributions to the deaths of men who might otherwise have survived. That same evening, 2 more men died, Private Jacob Bender and Octave Pavey, the doctor who had feuded with Greeley for 3 years, dying of starvation on the same day as the man whose execution he had not lived to witness. By June 6, 1884, 25 men became 7, and the rescue ships were still weeks away. After June 6th, the men who remained existed in a state that has no precise name in ordinary human experience, not merely hungry, not merely cold, not merely exhausted. All of these things simultaneously, in proportions that had dissolved the normal categories through which people understand their situation. Greeley wrote in his journal, "It is surprising with what calmness we view death, which, strongly as we hope, now seems inevitable. We have talked over the matter very calmly, and I have always exhorted the men to die as men and not as dogs." Lieutenant Kislingbury, who had spent 3 years without an official role, stripped of his position in those early weeks and unable to return home, died on June 1. Near the end, his mind had become considerably affected, talking at times like an infant, found dead in his sleeping bag. The remaining men no longer had the strength to carry his body to the burial site on the hill. They left him where he lay, just outside the tent. Sergeant Gardner, who had marveled at the aurora borealis 18 months earlier, who had described the colored fire in the sky in language that made the world seem richer, died June 12th of starvation. He had maintained his meteorological records until he could no longer hold a pencil. He died 10 days before the rescue ships arrived. Roderick Schneider reportedly begged for opium pills to accelerate his death. The surviving men refused. He died of starvation on June 18th, a slow and painful thing that no amount of courage could have made otherwise. The Inuit hunter Jens Edwards had died earlier, on April 24th, not of starvation, but drowning.
He had gone out on the ice to harpoon a seal and broken through. He went under and did not come back. His death deprived the expedition of its best hunter at the worst possible moment. By mid-June, 7 remained: Greely, Brainerd, Frederick, Long, Biederbick, Connell, and Corporal Ellison, whose feet and hands had been destroyed by frostbite months earlier, alive only because the others fed and cared for him. He weighed 78 pounds. 7 men in a half-collapsed tent. Outside, the Arctic summer progressed indifferently. The ice was retreating. The sun circled without setting. The rescue ships were coming as fast as they could. They would not know how little time remained. On June 21, Commander Winfield Schley's rescue expedition reached Smith Sound, just miles away from open water from Cape Sabine. But they did not reach the camp that day. One more day of weather, navigation, the 1,000 small obstacles of Arctic travel. In the tent, 6 men and their commander lay dying by degrees, waiting for a sound they had stopped believing would ever come.
Commander Winfield Scott Schley had planned the rescue of Adolphus Greely for months with the focus and intensity that all previous relief efforts had conspicuously lacked. He had studied the failed expeditions, the ice charts, the supply records, the contingency plans. He knew where Greely was supposed to be. On June 22, 1884, the USS Bear and USS Thetis reached Cape Sabine. Search parties spread out into a running Arctic gale. 3 teams were quartering the area when a sailor named G.B. Ewell came sprinting back, waving something in the air. A note from Greely giving his precise location, 3 miles north. Schley described what happened next as uncontrollable excitement spreading through both ships like lightning. Lieutenant Colwell took a small party to the coordinates and approached a half-collapsed tent nearly buried in snow, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. He crawled inside. What he found there was barely human. 6 men lay skeletal and motionless in sleeping bags. Greely was among them, his face unrecognizable against his earlier photographs, reduced by starvation to the structural architecture of a skull. Colwell took his hand. "Greely, is this you?" The answer came barely audible. "Yes, 7 of us left. Here we are, dying like men. Did what I came to do, beat the best record." Then he fell back, exhausted by speech. Colwell's men moved through the tent with the urgent precision of doctors at a mass casualty scene. Some men could not move, some were unconscious. Corporal Ellison's condition was so grave the rescuers initially could not determine whether he was alive. The men were carried to the ships. The bodies of 17 dead, preserved by the Arctic cold, were also collected and placed aboard. Military regulations required return to American soil for proper burial, a provision Schley honored, even though transporting 17 bodies home in summer heat would soon become a problem of its own kind. The rescue party noted immediately the tools used to net shrimp, the improvised shelters, the records kept with remarkable precision through everything, and the bodies of the dead that lay near the tent. Some of those bodies showed signs that would become, in the weeks that followed, the most controversial aspect of the entire expedition. The flesh had been cut from several of them. Schley was ordered by the War Department to keep the coffins sealed, officially for infection concerns. The expedition returned south. In St. John's, the news was telegraphed around the world: 6 survivors, 19 dead.
And then the details began to leak out.
The War Department ordered the coffins sealed because they understood what was inside had the potential to overshadow everything: the record, the science, the survival, the story of human endurance that, told cleanly, would have been genuinely inspiring. On August 14, 1884, the body of Lieutenant Kislingbury was exhumed in Rochester, New York. His family had given permission for an autopsy. The results were definitive and impossible to explain away. Flesh had been cut from his bones with a knife, not torn by animals, cut deliberately with the precision that requires tools and intent. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, newspapers across the country erupted. The story was simple and brutal. The survivors of the Greely expedition had kept themselves alive by eating their dead. Greely denied it. All surviving men denied it. Brainerd, who had controlled every gram of food at Camp Clay and whose meticulous records covered every ration from arrival to rescue, never wrote a single word about cannibalism in his diary. Given his obsessive precision, this omission is significant. Greely's explanation was this: in the desperate final weeks, the men had caught small pieces of flesh from corpses to use as bait for the shrimp nets. Not consumption, fishing. Whether this is true, partially true, or a carefully constructed public narrative cannot now be definitively answered. The truth belongs to the dead and to the 6 survivors who went to their graves without agreeing on a single version of it. What can be said is this: these men had consumed candle wax, boot leather, bird droppings. They had stretched every definition of what human beings will endure to stay alive. In that context, the line between what is imaginable and what is not becomes something very different from what it is in ordinary life. Greely returned to find himself simultaneously celebrated as a hero and condemned as a savage. Parades in Portsmouth, enormous crowds, and the next day, headlines asking whether the man who had led his men to death had then led the survivors to eat them. The questions about Cape Sabine never entirely went away, because the coffins had been sealed, and some things, once sealed, resist opening. But while the world was busy debating what the survivors had done to stay alive, it was largely ignoring the more important question: how they had stayed alive at all. And the answer to that question has one name: David Brainerd. He was 24 when the expedition departed, shaped by the Indian Wars into a soldier who understood that survival in hostile conditions is less about individual heroism than about the disciplined management of small critical details: rations, shelter, logistics, collective morale. Not glamorous skills, the skills that determine outcomes. At Fort Conger, Greely called him "my mainstay in many things." This was true, but understated. At Cape Sabine, his role became critical and considerably terrible. He controlled all food. Every meal was portioned to 1/100th of an ounce, adjusted downward with every death, a man calculating the arithmetic of survival on a scale built by someone who would himself die before spring. He also netted shrimp for hours each day in temperatures that kept other men inside, pulling in the tiny crustaceans that amounted to the last remaining margin between life and its opposite. He kept doing this after Rice died, after Lockwood died, after Israel died. Stopping meant accepting the margin was gone. He was the last survivor of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition, dying on March 22, 1946, 62 years after he had stood at the water's edge at Cape Sabine, netting shrimp in the freezing dark, keeping count of who was still alive. Late in his life, asked about the expedition, he said there would have been no survivors without Greely keeping them organized as a unit.
In the same breath, he acknowledged, to those who knew how to read his silences, that Greely could not have kept them organized without someone managing the details of that organization. He was describing a partnership, even if he would not use the word. Without both of them in exactly the roles they occupied, the tent at Cape Sabine would have been found empty, or worse. The Greely expedition is, among other things, a story about institutional failure, about the way ordinary bureaucratic dysfunction becomes, when the people affected are in sufficient extremity, something that functions like murder from a distance. The Signal Corps had embezzlement troubles. The Army and Navy couldn't agree responsibility. The Secretary of War had political concerns absorbing his attention. None of this was exceptional, just the ordinary operating conditions of a large government bureaucracy. But that ordinary dysfunction killed 18 men as surely as the Arctic did. Garlington had ignored his explicit orders to deposit supplies before pushing north. When the Proteus sank, it took provisions that, properly deposited as ordered, would have sustained 25 men through the entire winter in relative comfort. Instead, they had 40 days' worth of food for a 9-month winter. Garlington was court-martialed, found guilty, formally reprimanded, continued his army career, was later promoted, lived until 1934. Greely, whose men died partly because of Garlington's failure, was not court-martialed. He was a hero, celebrated in the same newspapers that published rumors of cannibalism, which the American public held in both hands simultaneously, without finding the contradiction troubling. The Congressional Medal of Honor Greely received in 1935 was officially for contributions to exploration and science. It was also, less officially, an acknowledgement that the United States had failed one of its officers in the most complete and irreversible way, and that this piece of metal was the only form of accountability the system was prepared to offer 50 years after the fact. Greely was 91 when he received it. He accepted it with composed dignity. He did not accuse anyone. He was a soldier, and soldiers accept the outcomes of battles, even the ones their own side loses. And yet, embedded inside this story of governmental failure and institutional shame, there is a dimension the sensational narratives have almost entirely obscured: the scientific work these men actually accomplished, and what the world has done with it since. The men at Fort Conger took weather measurements 3 times daily, without exception, for nearly 2 years. Temperature, barometric pressure, wind speed, humidity, precipitation. Sergeant Gardner rebuilt an entire chronograph from scratch after the original was damaged. 21-year-old Sergeant Israel produced astronomical observations from a latitude no one had ever systematically studied before. None of it was lost. When the rescue ships found the survivors at Cape Sabine, they also found the expedition's scientific records, carefully packed and preserved through everything. Even in the final weeks when men were dying in their sleeping bags, the journals and measurement books were wrapped and kept safe. Greely had given specific instructions. The records were to be protected. The meteorological data from Fort Conger became, a century later, essential baseline material for climate science. Scientists studying Arctic warming needed historical temperature records predating industrial changes to the climate, and the Greely expedition's measurements provided exactly that.
The temperatures Sergeant Gardner recorded in -40-degree conditions in the winters of 1981 and 1982 are compared today against current measurements to document Arctic warming over more than 100 years. Edward Israel, who died at 21 without returning to the classroom where he had learned to read the stars, contributed to a body of knowledge that outlasted everyone he ever knew. This is not a consolation. It does not offset the deaths or compensate for the institutional failures, but the dead men contributed to our understanding of the planet they died on. That deserves to be said clearly, in a story that has mostly been told in other terms.
6 men survived: Greely, Brainerd, Frederick, Long, Biederbick, and Connell. Corporal Ellison died aboard the rescue ship on July 8th, both legs amputated, 78 pounds, 24 years old. The 6 who made it home returned to enormous parades and immediate controversy, the celebration and the cannibalism headlines arriving almost simultaneously. Greely went on to a distinguished career. Brainerd retired as a brigadier general and died in 1946, the last survivor, outliving every man he had fed through that winter. Julius Frederick, who had buried George Rice in the ice and walked back alone, named his daughters Thetis and Sabine, after the rescue ship and the cape where his friend had died in his arms. What the survivors shared was a particular reticence about the worst of what they had witnessed. The oath about who fired the shot that killed Private Henry was only one of many silences they maintained until death. Whatever had happened in that tent, they had already decided how to answer. Pym Island is still there. The stone walls of Camp Clay are still visible, low, weathered, the outline of the shelter where 19 men died. The tent is gone. The landscape has absorbed almost everything, returning it to the same undifferentiated rock and ice that existed before 25 soldiers arrived to fight winter with their bare hands. This story refuses comfort because the world it describes is not comfortable. Governments make promises they don't keep, and the people who trusted them pay with their bodies. Good men make bad decisions. Bad men make understandable ones. The strongest man in the camp steals from the dying and is shot for it, and the men who shoot him go to their graves without revealing who pulled the trigger. 25 men sailed toward the top of the world in 1881. 6 came back. Greely never wrote about what he felt in that tent, dying in his sleeping bag, waiting for a sound he had stopped believing would come. Whatever that was, he kept it. He carried them the whole way. If this story moved you, subscribe and join us for more true stories of survival, resilience, and what ordinary people discover they are capable of when the world leaves them no other choice.